Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a single everyday word and putting it under a microscope. Actually, scratch that. It's more like turning it like a prism to see how it radically shapes entirely different corners of human society. You know, it's a word we hear literally every day, yet its applications are so wildly diverse that they almost seem contradictory when you put them side by side.
So, let's dive right in with a fundamental question. What does the word discipline actually mean? Because as we dig into our source materials today, we're going to see that this one single word can mean the whole shebang. Everything from organized learning in higher ed to workplace HR protocols, the historical penal system, and even childhood development. It's this fascinating concept that bridges the gap between punishment, structure, and really profound personal growth. To help us navigate this thematic whiplash without getting totally lost, here's our roadmap. 1. The meaning of discipline. 2. Academic fields of knowledge. 3. Power, punishment, and prisons. 4. Corrective action at work. And 5. Nurturing growth and development.
All right, Section 1, the meaning of discipline, turning the prism. Let's start by laying out exactly how this concept evolved to cover so many different facets of our lives.
Moving into Section 2, Academic Fields of Knowledge, Cataloging Human Thought. We begin our journey in the realm of academia, where discipline is historically rooted in how we organize human knowledge itself.
Historically speaking, an academic discipline is basically just a giant filing cabinet for human thought. Way back in 1231 at the University of Paris, education was grouped into 4 main faculties: theology, medicine, canon law, and the arts. But, as the scholarly community started churning out more and more information, disciplines became the essential way to categorize all that knowledge. And that eventually led to the highly specialized academic departments we all recognize today.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Modern researchers from the Intrepid Network are actually trying to break out of those traditional filing cabinets. When looking at the future of these fields, they draw a super sharp contrast between multidisciplinarity, which is simply different traditional disciplines working together toward a common goal, and transdisciplinarity. Now, transdisciplinarity is a massive leap forward. It actively brings in non-academic knowledge, acting as a direct interface between academia and real-world practice to solve incredibly complex societal problems. It's all about looking outwards.
Which brings us to Section 3, Power, Punishment, and Prisons, a microphysics of power. Now we're going to pivot sharply from the university over to the justice system to examine the philosophy of Michel Foucault.
Foucault neutrally contrasts 2 historical forms of penal control to show a really radical shift in Western society. On one hand, you have the 18th century, which was characterized by violent, chaotic public spectacle, like the gruesome execution of Robert François Damiens. But in less than a century, that system totally transformed into the 19th century prison, perfectly exemplified by the Maître penal colony, which relied heavily on incredibly regimented daily schedules. Foucault argues the shift away from physical torture wasn't just for humanitarian reasons. No, it was the birth of what he calls a microphysics of power, essentially a web of constant, invisible surveillance and strict scheduling meant to carefully monitor and control the human body in places like prisons, schools, and military barracks.
So the absolutely crucial point in Foucault's analysis is captured right here. He writes that modern discipline is actually a mechanism of societal subjection. Power and knowledge are intrinsically linked. The system literally creates the individual's identity as a way to control them. In other words, discipline in this context isn't a subject you study. It's an invisible framework that studies and molds you into a compliant citizen.
Okay, moving on to Section 4, Corrective Action at Work, Protocols and Legal Risks. Let's shift our focus once more, moving from philosophical power dynamics to the modern, practical reality of corporate human resources. In the workplace, discipline takes on a heavily procedural tone. Our sources from EmployCo USA outline how modern employers rely on structured discipline primarily to minimize legal risks. Before taking any action at all, an employer has to establish a clear, lawful, and non-discriminatory reason for doing it. Workplace discipline isn't supposed to be some arbitrary punishment, right? It absolutely must be tied directly to a specific employer policy or a performance issue to avoid costly legal challenges and to protect employee morale.
This plays out as a highly structured narrative of progressive action. If an employee is underperforming, HR guidelines recommend moving from the least to the most severe action. You might start with a simple verbal warning for an isolated issue, escalate to a written warning, and then utilize a performance improvement plan or a PIP. What I really love about this is the focus on remediation. A PIP gives an employee straightforward, objective, and measurable goals to correct their behavior before escalating to something drastic like a suspension. It's a structured pathway meant to guide an individual right back to success.
And finally, Section 5, Nurturing Growth and Development, Positive Discipline. For our final turn of the prism, we end on a highly constructive note by looking at how discipline applies to child psychology and teaching.
Unlike the punitive penal models or strict corporate compliance we just talked about, child educators advocate for something called positive discipline. As highlighted by the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative, positive discipline respects child rights and healthy development. Now, this absolutely does not mean permissiveness or having zero rules. Instead, it combines structure with warmth, so children feel completely safe making mistakes. This approach ultimately fuels a lifelong love of learning and self-respect, and it totally removes the use of violence or humiliation from the equation.
If you look at these 5 core components, you can actually see the real-time journey of an effective teacher or parent. It starts with resisting the urge to just react to short-term frustration, like a noisy classroom, and instead identifying long-term goals. Do you want the child to be confident and responsible? Well, then you have to provide warmth and structure. You have to understand child development, realizing that a child's way of thinking constantly changes as they grow. By recognizing individual differences, educators can problem-solve constructively, turning moments of conflict into really vital learning opportunities.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. We've seen how discipline organizes our universities, shapes our justice systems, structures our workplaces, and nurtures our children. So whether it was an academic field you dedicated years to studying, an HR protocol you encountered at your job, or the warmth and structure of a teacher who guided you when you were young, which form of this incredibly complex concept has most profoundly shaped who you are today? Take a moment to think about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.